would, but I'm going to, it's a little bit different maybe than what I've been doing. I'm not going to kind of walk through the entire beginning of Job, but I just want us to understand there's some things going on in Job that we need to recognize, and it kind of helps us understand what Job is really all about. And one of the things that we see in Job is this statement that Satan makes about God putting this hedge around Job. And I just want us to understand a little bit about what that's about, because it's more than just protecting him. It is protecting him. There was a protection around him that God set up. And I know that each one of us are thankful for that hedge. I think most of us who are believers and who trust in him, we experience this hedge around us because we're choosing to follow him. But I just want us to understand a little bit more about that. And this, in the Israelite mind, this idea of a hedge had a little bit to do, you think of it, a hedge as a boundary. It's like a dividing line between, say, you and your neighbors, or you could think of it even as a city, having a hedge of protection around it. A lot of cities were built either up high, on mountains, that sort of thing. There was an idea of a division. There might be a valley between you and the next city, and so you had this like natural protection. And so, the idea of a hedge had to do with this idea of a boundary. And it may not be immediately apparent, but actually if we go back to, once again, to the creation story, and I say story, but I just mean the account of creation that we find in Genesis 1 and 2, we see some interesting things in that chapter, chapter 1 especially, about separating. And so we see the Spirit hovering on the waters, this kind of, it is the concept of a hedge there. And then we see this, separation of day from night. We see separation of waters below from the waters above. We see separation of the waters from the land. We see these boundaries being created. Even within the various accounts of creation of the different species, there was this idea of separation. They produce seed after their kind. And so there was this separation of different species of creatures that were created, land animals and sea animals, and of course of mankind. There were all of these boundaries being created. And I think, we spoke about this a few weeks back when we talked about the idea of that creation was really about moving from this chaos, this disorder, the words without form and void. There was this disorder, and God created an order to things, and he put in place an order. And so it turns out that when Job was living within God's order, there was a protection over him that was inherent in the fact that he was living according to God's choice, God's order. And so he was fearing God, and he was turning away from evil. But, really you could just think of that as, there was a proper order to things. And of course, what is the first commandment? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's an order. There's the Most High God, and then we are subservient. We worship, we submit to the Most High God. There's this order to things. And so as we go through chapter 29, 30, and 31 today, we're going to see some of this. Actually, when we get to chapter 31, we're going to see where Job talks about the choices he made in life, and he was living according to this order. And so, I just think that it's important for us to understand this idea of a hedge carried with it this idea of living according to this order, there was this boundary. And so what God allowed, Satan said, you've put this hedge around him. And God said, okay, I'm going to allow you to I'm going to remove a boundary so that you can now, touch him. You can disorder things. Think of the things that happened. It was like a sense of decreation. It was death was involved. Destruction was involved. There was a chaos involved as Satan did these different things. And he was removing this order. He was bringing a chaos and disorder to Job's life. And yet, Job sought to maintain a proper order in his personal fearing of God, even through this time. He was continuing to maintain that order in his heart of holding God in this sense of awe and fearing him and turning away from evil. Now, he was struggling with a question, the question of why, and if you were to read through the entire book of Job looking for the answer to why, do you think that you would find the answer to why? And of course, we know that we do not find an answer to why did God allow suffering in Job's life. We do not find the answer to why. What we find is God gives a response that we'll get to in chapters, I can't remember exactly which chapters, 38 to 40, I believe it is. Anyway, and we're going to see that God doesn't give a direct answer to why. He sidesteps the whole thing, and he says Job isn't capable of understanding. And actually, he turns to creation, which is interesting. So we see creation referenced throughout the book of Job. And a few weeks ago, we talked about how Job was talking about searching creation, and we talked about how God created all of these things, and he created us to have dominion over the creation. And so in searching for wisdom, man has great dominion, but wisdom eludes us. And so the answer to finding wisdom was given to us last week in verse 28 of chapter 28, and really it's the central theme of the book. If you want to find one verse that says, what is the answer? It is verse 28. And he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. And that is the answer. It sidesteps the question of suffering. It says, even when you suffer, continue to fear the Lord and turn away from understanding, and that is wisdom itself. Continue to walk with God. So as we open up chapter 29 today, we're going to see that each of these chapters has kind of its own theme going on, and chapter 29 is where Job is grieving losses. And chapter 30 is where he's mourning his present misery and suffering. And chapter 30 is two things really. It's an oath of innocence and then a demand of vindication. And so this really is Job's final defense. Job does speak later in the book, but this is his final defense. In all of these debates that have gone on with his friends, this is his final defense, and really he's making the defense to God. And so we're going to take the time this morning to read these sections together. If you'll bear with me, I need to go back a couple chapters in the 29. So right after he's made this statement, the theme of the book, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. Now Job kind of gets that, and yet it's really a head knowledge, I think, at this point in time, and it's going to become a heart knowledge by the end of the book. And I know that it's a head knowledge because in spite of the fact that he says that's the conclusion, he goes back and now he's going to make a defense. A defense against what, you say? Well, his friends really have made the case that he's suffering because he did evil. And so he's ultimately going to make the defense, no, I haven't lived according to evil. I've lived according to God's order, and yet I'm suffering. And so that's kind of where we're at. And so chapter 29, verse 1. Again, Job took up his discourse and said, "Oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me." And you can see he's looking back. He's saying, oh, that, I want the good old days to come back. Don't we ever want that? Sometimes we think about the way things used to be, and we've gone through these difficulties. People have passed away, and different things have happened, and, we've lost, might have lost money, or might have lost relationships, and had difficulties. We long for the good old days. A lot of times, I know that I experienced a little bit of that as I was, an adult, and you come responsible for things, and you have these, you're bearing this burden of responsibility of having to, provide, having to make ends meet, having to make decisions, and you kind of long for the good old days when you were at home and your parents would take care of things and you didn't have to worry about things as much as you do as an adult. And so Job was looking back and saying, oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me. Now, is God still watching over Job? Well, I think that we know he is, but we're given a little bit of insight in chapters 1 and 2 that Job didn't ever have. And so Job, all he sees is he saw God's blessing, and then he saw that taken away. In his mind, it was taken away, the blessings that he'd experienced, and things were, he was now living in this chaos, and God was silent. And so during this time when God is silent, we often get the idea that, and it's understandable, we feel like God's not really there. He's not really, we don't hear anything from him. We don't see his hand at work at times, and so we're tempted to feel this way. I wish that we were back in the good old days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and by his light I walked through darkness. I didn't have to guess where I was going. I wasn't like groping through the darkness. You wake up, the power goes out, and you wake up in the middle of the night, and maybe you have to go check the breaker, whatever. You're tripping through the house. You're kind of groping through. No, went back in the day, God's lamp shone upon his head, and he knew where he was going because by God's light he could walk through the darkness. And now he doesn't feel that. It's like God's not there. And as I was in my prime, when the friendship of God was upon my tent. He doesn't feel that friendship of God. It's like, we think about people with the phrase walking with God. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. This idea of walking with God. Adam and Eve would walk with God in the cool of the evening. And of course, that's a wonderful thing, but sometimes we don't feel that. And I'm using the word feel here because this kind of gets in our way. He might have known that God was with him, but we do. We have feelings. We have, we want to feel God's presence, and sometimes we don't feel his presence. Obviously, we shouldn't rely on our feelings as the source of truth or to guide us, but this is just a natural, it's a human thing. We have these feelings, and we want to feel his presence. And so he's mourning, in a sense, he's mourning the loss of his friendship with God. It's not that God had left him, but he didn't think God was still his friend walking with him. He didn't feel God there or hear God there. And then he goes on, he says, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were all around me. And so he's also mourning the loss of his family, his children. And, of course, that's a very legitimate loss. It's a real loss. No one can say that this was, we say loss of his friendship with God. Well, God still was his friend. It's just that Job wasn't seeing what he wanted to see, what he thought he should see. And when you come to his children, they really were gone. They had died. They had perished. It goes on in verse 6, when my steps were washed with butter. Just the thing that comes to my mind is just that it was nice and soft and smooth and easy, and there was no, just think of the difference between stepping in butter or stepping on jagged rocks. This just comes to my mind. And he says, and the rock poured out for me the streams of oil. Again, there was this abundance. There was this, life was easy. Things were good. I didn't have it wasn't a struggle like it is now, just to kind of get through the day. And when I went out to the gate of the city, and when I prepared my seat in the square, the young men saw me and withdrew, and the aged rose and stood. Now he's moved from the idea of loss of friendship with God and loss of family, and now he's looking at loss of the community, his standing in the community. He would go out, and this idea of the gate of the city was where all sorts of things were conducted. It was a marketplace, that was one thing. But it was also, where business was conducted, and it was also where, legal questions were resolved. And so he was important. And he's looking back and he's saying, when I went out to the gate of the city and I had a seat in the square, I was important. The young men saw me and withdrew. They, maybe young whippersnappers, you might say. They didn't challenge me. Even the aged men rose, and with respect they stood. And the princes, even the princes, so royalty, refrained from talking and laid their hands on their mouths. They were quiet. They had this respect for him. The voice of the nobles was hushed, and their tongue stuck to the roof of their mouth. They were quiet. They didn't interrupt him. They listened to him. When the ear heard, it called me blessed, and when the eye saw, it approved. And so we see this whole sense of he had a place in the community where he was lifted up, and even the ear heard the things that he said meant something to the community. He was listened to. But again, he's mourning the loss of this. He goes on, he says, because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to help him. And so he's not just saying, I was important. He's saying, yes, I was important, but part of my importance came from the fact that I delivered the poor who cried for help. I helped the poor. I had abundance, and I helped the poor. I didn't use my abundance to gain more abundance. I used my abundance to help the poor. And I was a father to the fatherless who had none to help him. I helped them. And, so Job is going through here, and I just want to pause here and note that if you think about a lot of the things that Job is saying, both in chapters 29 and 30, we're going to see a lot of things that should be familiar from our study in Deuteronomy or maybe Exodus and Leviticus, these laws that God gave, this this way of living that God had given to his people Israel. And even though we don't know the exact time frame, we talked about this when we began the study, we don't know exactly when Job lived, but it's apparent that he lived probably around the time of the patriarchs, probably around the time of Abraham, and probably before the law of Moses, and yet he was living according to this, and again, remember this word, according to God's order of things. And so we can think of the law of Moses as God's order of things. This is the way I want things to be ordered. This is the way, if you live according to this order of things, then you'll find blessing. And so here Job is, and as he goes through, I just want us to kind of just allow the ideas of the way God wanted the Israelites to live, and oh, by the way he wants us to live, that we see in the New Testament, all these ideas, these themes of how we take care of the poor and the fatherless. Remember the widows and orphans that we studied in the book of James? That is true religion. This is the order of things that God wants us. He will bless us so that we can bless other people. He goes on, he says in verse 13, the blessing of him who was about to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I think that first phrase has to do with that Job found himself blessed when he would go and maybe visit someone who was on their deathbed and they were about to perish, and yet he found himself blessed by that visit. And I think that happens often when someone is at a point and they realize that they're on their deathbed. A lot of times there's wisdom that comes out because their priorities have been rearranged. And so we can find blessing in listening to someone who is facing the end of their life. And he says, I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. Again, the widows and the orphans. And so he goes on, I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. And so he said, I was concerned with righteousness and justice. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. Again, I did things for people who had infirmities. I helped them. I was a father to the needy, and I searched out the cause of him whom I did not know. I would help people. I picture there a counselor. Maybe he's at the gate of the city, and someone has a need, a problem, and they come and they consult with him. And so I searched out the cause of him whom I did not know. Makes me think of an example, and I won't give any details, but Fred shared how he had someone come and introduce himself and kind of pour out some issues of life, and it's that kind of thing where you had an opportunity to not necessarily counsel, but have an impact and help him. Anyway, verse 17, I broke the fangs of unrighteousness and made him drop his prey from his teeth. Of course, that's a bit of a metaphor there, but the idea of, again, this has to do with making things right, of justice, and preventing those who were unrighteous from preying upon other people. Verse 18, then I thought, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sand. My roots spread out to the waters, with the dew all night on my branches, my glory fresh with me, and my bow ever new in my hand. And I know that we read that first phrase, I shall die in my nest, and we think that's a negative thing, but he's not saying something negative. He's saying God's blessing will be on me my entire life until I die. And so I will, this nest, this hedge around me, this this home that God has provided for me, I will die in my nest. My days will be multiplied as the sand. And in my, so my roots spread out to the waters, there will be a source of nourishment with the dew on my branches, that brings to my mind I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses. Okay, sorry, I forgot the detail, the specific words. But anyway, these ideas of the dew on the branches. You go out in the morning and it's just peaceful, and it's things are refreshed and cool, especially on the hot days of summer. It's nice to go out, and even if you get your feet wet in the grass, that's okay, because that's a sign of that refreshment that comes. My glory fresh with me, and my bow ever new in my hand. This idea that think God will continue to provide. There's the bow gives me the idea of someone who's a hunter, who is providing, who is strong. And then he goes on in verse 21, and he kind of returns to this idea of the community. He says, "Men listened to me and waited and kept silence for my counsel." There's some people that may not say that many words, but when they do, you need to listen, because they're going to be wise. And you get the idea that's what this this is here, is that there's wisdom, and so they kept silent and they listened for his counsel. After I spoke, they didn't speak again, and my word dropped upon them. They pondered what I said. I almost, with the word dropped there, it's almost like what we think of today with a mic drop moment, where, okay, I say what I'm going to say, and then I drop the mic. No more needs to be said. And that's kind of what, the idea here is. They didn't need to respond. They just had to think through what he said and contemplate it. And there was real value in what he had said. He was taken seriously. They waited for me as for the rain, and they opened their mouths as for the spring rain. And so, you think in the hot weather, and we're trying to grow a garden or grow crops, you want it to rain periodically, and so you're waiting for the rain. Farmers will wait for the rain in order to, see their crops grow. And this is, the idea. So they waited for him in that way, because his words were going to bring refreshment and nourishment, and so they were waiting for it. I don't know if this phrase is exactly what it sounds like, but they open their mouths as for the spring rain. Did you ever see it, especially when it's snowing? The kids go out and they try to catch snowflakes in their mouth, and that's just, it's like a novelty. It's cold, it's not really providing a lot of nourishment, but they're just longing for what he has, what he's going to say. I smiled on them when they had no confidence. In other words, I encouraged them when they needed encouragement. And the light of my face they did not cast down. They received his encouragement. They were glad for it. And then verse 25, I chose their way and sat as chief, and I lived like a king among his troops, like one who comforts mourners. And so you get, there's a lot of pictures there, but he's looking back again, and he's grieving the loss of what was. And I think that, that we'll get into this a little bit later, but I think that's okay. I don't think there's anything wrong with him looking back and mourning the loss of what had been. Now he's going to go on, and he's going to turn in chapter 30, and really he's going to spend some time mourning his present misery. He says, but now, and that's the two words that give us this signal. He's turning from looking back to looking at now, but now they laugh at me. Those who listened to me and who were eager to hear my words, now they laugh at me. Men who are younger than I, so now we're saying the younger ones. Remember, before the younger ones, I called them the whippersnappers, they would not challenge him. They would go off and give him his place. But now, men younger than I, so you maybe see that group of people whose fathers I would have disdained to set with the dogs of my flock. I wouldn't even want their fathers to have set with the dogs of my flock. In other words, I viewed them as, and this is interesting, I think that there's a reality that there are those who are, and I think, and I can't remember exactly what passage it is, talks about the worthless men. It was in Acts. It was the rabble-rousers and worthless. You remember we saw that, and this is the idea that I get from this. Their fathers I wouldn't even have had respect for. And these are the young men, their children, and they don't respect me. They laugh at me. What could I gain from the stretch of their hands? Men whose vigor is gone. Through want and hard hunger, they gnaw the dry ground by night in waste and desolation. This is describing these young men whose fathers he had no respect for, and is describing the kind of people that they are. Gnaw the dry ground by night in waste and desolation. They pick saltwort and the leaves of bushes and the roots of the broom tree for their food. They're not eating, fruit and, the lush vegetation that God provides for us. No, they're eating these things that are, again, it's just showing their worthlessness. They are driven out from human company. They shout after them as a thief. In the gullies of the torrents they must dwell, in holes of the earth and of the rocks. Among the bushes they bray, under the nettles they huddle together. A senseless, a nameless brood, they have been whipped out of the land. And yet this is the group that is now laughing at him. So he has not only lost all of the respect that he had, but he's now become a laughingstock. Verse 9, and now I become their song. I am a byword to them. It's like, Job became kind of a meme. You trusted God and look at you. He just became, they abhor me and keep aloof from me. They do not hesitate to spit at the sight of me. Job has now become below this group that he's described as this worthless group of people, of men, because God has loosed my cord and humbled me. They have cast off restraint in my presence. Cast off restraint. They don't even restrain themselves from anything they want to do or say. Sometime you might, if you're in a downtown area of a city, I don't know about you, but you have to be careful sometimes where you go. And it just sounds like I got in a bad part of town and I'm in trouble. I'm all alone, They don't even, there's no restraint in what they will do or say. On my right hand the rabble rise. They push away my feet. They cast up against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They need no one to help them. As through a wide breach they come, amid the crash they roll on. Terrors are turned upon me. My honor is pursued as by the wind, and my prosperity has passed away like a cloud. Not only have I lost everything, but the way he's being treated through here, it's just, he's like nothing. and now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. You know, with that time when that pain, it just never takes a break. It never goes away. You know, you heard that expression, you know, someone can't get a break. Well, the pain, the difficulty that he's going through just continues to be there. It's just persistent, and it never takes a rest. With great force, my garment is disfigured. It binds me about like the collar of my tunic. God has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. And note there, Job now attributes to God having cast him down to this level that he's at now. Become like the dust and ashes, which were symbols of, distraught, of being undone. I cry to you for help, and you do not answer me. Now he's talking to God. I stand, and you only look at me. You have turned cruel to me, he says of God. With the might of your hand, you persecute me. Your power now is turned against me to persecute me. You lift me up on the wind. You make me ride on it, and you toss me about in the roar of the storm. For I know that you will bring me to death, and to the home appointed to the house appointed for all the living. You know, he's talking to God, but God, you're going to bring me to my end, to my death. Yet does not one in a heap of ruins stretch out his hand, and in his disaster cry for help? So he's reached, even one in that situation will reach for help. Did not I weep for him whose day was hard? In other words, Job had cared for others when they needed help, when they were going through things. Was not my soul grieved for the needy? But when I hoped for good, evil came. When I waited for light, darkness came. My inward parts are in turmoil and never still. Days of affliction come to meet me. I'd go about darkened, but not by the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin turns black and falls from me, and my bones burn with heat. My lyre is turned to mourning. You know, that musical instrument that David played for King Saul, my lyre is turned to mourning, and my pipe to the voice of those who weep. So, he's now gone through and he's basically mourned his present misery, the state that he's in right now. And it's dire, for sure. I think that some of his assessment is wrong, because he thinks that God, has turned his might against him. He doesn't understand that God still loves him. He thinks that God has for some reason decided to destroy him. That's not what happened. We know that, but Job didn't know that. What he saw, the evidence that he had, was that God had blessed him, and he loved and feared God. He turned from evil, and God blessed him, and now suddenly God's blessing was removed. Now we come to chapter 31, and what we have now is this really two things. As I said earlier, first thing we see is this oath of innocence. He's declaring his innocence, and he goes through most of the chapter that way, and then we come to verses 35 to 37, and we see this demand for vindication. So now he's going to declare his innocence. He starts out in verse 31, and he asks a question. He says, I have made a covenant with my eyes, how then could I gaze at a virgin? And so he's saying here that he has made this covenant with his eyes, and so it's not just that he's pure, sexually pure. He's saying even with his eyes, and we know that Jesus said that you don't have to commit adultery if you lust with your eyes. You see someone and you lust with your eyes, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart, he says. Well, Job says, I made a covenant with my eyes. I made a commitment, and I wasn't going to gaze at a virgin. I wasn't going to long for, lust for something that was improper for me. And again, I want us to know this is living within God's order. God had set an order. He set an order, and he gave a man and a woman to be together. And basically we see the first marriage in Genesis chapter 1. And so Job had said, I'm committed to living within this order of God's design. He goes on, what would be my portion from God above, and my heritage from the Almighty on high? In other words, if I chose to violate this order that God has put into place, then what would happen to me? What could I expect? Verse 3, is not calamity for the unrighteous and disaster for the workers of iniquity? If I made that choice to live opposed to God's order, then I could expect calamity. I could expect disaster. And yet, he's declaring, I have made this covenant and I have kept this covenant. I have lived pure, a pure life, with a pure heart. And then he says, does not he see my ways and number all my steps? The Almighty sees what I do. He knows my heart. He knows what I do. He knows that I've been pure. And then he goes on in verse 5, if I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened to deceit. Okay, so again, some of the Ten Commandments come out. This is part of God's order. We're not to live with deceit. We're to live with honesty. So he says, if I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened to deceit. And then this is a parenthetical in my translation. It says, let me be weighed in a just balance and let God know my integrity. And so he's saying, God, be the judge. Consider what I've done. He's offering himself up to be judged, essentially. He says, if my step has turned aside from the way and my heart has gone after my eyes, one of the three, we see the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, and this is yet another one of those. He's gone after my eyes. The lust of the eyes. I see something and I want it. If my step has turned aside from the way and my heart has gone after my eyes, and then he says, and if any spot has stuck to my hands, and I think that really is talking about if I, like the idea of shoplifting, if I've stolen, if I've taken things that weren't mine, stuck to my hands, and then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. So in other words, he's saying, okay, if I've done those things, then let what I sow be for another to eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. In other words, then I expect a consequence. If I take something that's not mine, then I expect to lose what I have. I expect that consequence. He goes on in verse 9, if my heart has been enticed toward a woman, and I have lain in wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down on her. In other words, if I've been, unfaithful to my wife, then let someone come and take my wife, and she be unfaithful to me. For that would be a heinous crime. That would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges. For that would be a fire that consumes as far as Abaddon, and it would burn to the root all my increase. And Abaddon is, again, this idea of the place of death. And so, he's saying the consequence would be dire. And he understands the consequence would be dire. And that's why he's chosen to live within God's order, God's design. But he's saying, if I didn't choose to live that way, then let these things happen to me. Verse 13, if I have rejected the cause of my manservant or my maidservant when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? So, the idea, if they've brought and accused me of something, even though they're my servant, my manservant or maidservant, if they bring a complaint against me, then I need to listen and I need to make it right. What shall I do if God rises up? He understands that God will take up their cause. And of course, once again, we see that echoed throughout the law of Moses. We see this idea of justice, and God will take up their cause, even with the idea of widows and orphans. We know that God will be a father to the fatherless and a husband to the widow. What then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes inquiry, what shall I answer him? And of course, I think there of Adam and Eve in the garden where God said, where are you? Of course, we know God knew exactly where they were. That was what we call the great interrogation. And they had to give an answer, and the answer they gave was to blame someone else. But Job doesn't want to be that way. He says, when God comes and asks of me, why did you treat your servants in this way, and you didn't take responsibility for the complaints against you, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him? In other words, the same God made me in my mother's womb that made those servants in their mother's womb. We started out equal, didn't we? We started out all really not just equal, but as human sinners. And so, and did not one fashion us in the womb? And God is the author of all life. And so, of course I should treat other people the same as I expect to be treated. And so, he's recognizing God's divine creative power over him. And so, verse 16, if I have withheld anything that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the fatherless has not eaten of it. In other words, these things aren't true. He has not withheld. He's given to the poor. He's helped them. He's helped the widows. He hasn't just eaten his own, blessings, food, and so on. He's shared with the fatherless who needed, those who were hungry. And verse 18 again is a parenthetical note, for from my youth the fatherless grew up with me as with a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. In other words, all my life I treated those who were fatherless, the orphans, as if I was their father. I took care of them, I loved them, I cared for them. And I cared for the widow as well. It's interesting to me that time and again he comes back to this idea that I mentioned we see in James of the widow and the orphan, caring for widows and orphans. That is what James says is true religion. And really the word religion there has more to do with a way of living according to God's standard. Verse 19, if I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or the needy without covering, if his body has not blessed me, if he was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, all of these things, he's saying I did give clothing to those who needed, provided whatever blankets, whatever warmth when they needed to be covered. I did, do what I could. I warmed them with the fleece of my sheep. if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, in other words, if I have treated orphans inappropriately because I saw my help in the gate. In other words, so now he's really, if this influence of this concern about how others would look at him, if he did wrong to the fatherless, to the orphans, then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder and let my arm be broken from its socket. In other words, if I've done that, then let my arm just fall off. Obviously, he's not saying literally, he's just saying, I haven't done that. I haven't treated the orphans badly in that way. For I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty. So, just think of the relationship that he's describing God as, his majesty. And so, there's this idea, again, this is an order thing. This is where we have the Most High and how God would treat him if he treated the orphans badly. And so he's recognizing that he has a responsibility to care for the orphans just as God cares for him. He goes on in verse 24, if I have made my gold my trust, or called fine gold my confidence. In other words, if I've placed my trust in riches. God provided for me, but that doesn't mean that I have to take my trust out of God and put it in the riches that he gave me. Verse 25, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was abundant, or because my hand had found much. Obviously, there's a thankfulness we can have for abundance that God provides for us, but it's not in his wealth that he was rejoicing. It's in God's provision that he should rejoice. So if I have even rejoiced because my wealth was abundant, or because my hand had found much, if I have looked at the sun when it shone, or the moon moving in splendor. And I think that this has to do with this idea of many of the cultures around of course we studied as Paul went around the different cultures around, Asia Minor, and a lot of them worshipped, and a lot of them worshipped creation, and they worshipped the sun and the moon, instead of recognizing those things were made for us by God, and God is the one we should worship. But he's saying, I haven't looked at the sun when it shone, the moon in moving in splendor. I haven't worshipped those things, allowed those things to become objects of my worship. Verse 27, and my heart has been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand. In other words, again, this has the idea of following what I want, what my heart values. My mouth has kissed my hand would be this idea of blessing. A kiss was, kissing a hand was considered a blessing, giving a blessing, and he wasn't like kissing his own hand. He wasn't like wishing this blessing on himself. This would also be an iniquity to be punished by the judges, for I would have been false to God above. In other words, I would have been attributing my blessing, the things that I had, to myself instead of attributing it to Almighty God who gave it to me. I would have been living in this false world of believing that I was responsible. Verse 29, if I have rejoiced at the ruin of him who hated me, or exulted when evil overtook him. Now, how many of us, when we see evil happen in the world, do we not, at least secretly, if not even outwardly, wish for their destruction? We wish that they would be, you might see someone who does something wrong, and we wish they would be, arrested. Well, in one sense, I think it's okay for us to wish for justice, but, Job is saying, I haven't rejoiced at the ruin of him who hated me just because he hated me, or I haven't exulted, been happy when evil overtook him. And then verse 30 again is a parenthetical note that he says, I have not let my mouth sin by asking for his life with a curse. I haven't prayed for his destruction. Verse 31, if the men of my tent have not said, who is there that has not been filled with his meat? Okay, in other words, if his people that he's responsible for, he's provided for. Okay, and verse 32 again is a parenthetical note. The sojourner has not lodged in the street. I have opened my doors to the traveler. In other words, I have provided for people who had need. I was hospitable. Verse 33, if I have concealed my transgressions, as others do, by hiding my iniquity in my heart. You know, that's one of the things that we don't like to do. We don't like to be honest about our sin. We don't like to expose our sin to people around us. And I'm not saying we should go around, airing our dirty laundry all over the place, but we need to be honest about our temptation and our sin. And so he says, I haven't hidden my sin. I haven't concealed my transgression, hiding my iniquity in my heart. Why? Because I stood, I'm sorry, we'll get to that in a minute. This is saying, why would I hide iniquity in my heart? Because I stood in great fear of the multitude, and the contempt of families terrified me, so I kept silence and did not go out of doors. So he's just saying, a lot of times we're motivated by what will it do to my reputation? How will people think of me? How will I be treated? I don't want to let people know that I've done bad things. And interestingly, I don't know in your Bible if you see this or not, but at the end of verse 34, there's a dash in my Bible. And the dash obviously was not part of the original writing, but this is a representation in this translation that he just kind of drops off this whole discussion of how he has lived, and he kind of interrupts himself now with these next three verses. He says, given all of these things that I've just said, I've tried to live uprightly. And actually we know that he has, because God said he was upright. In the beginning of the book, we know that he was upright. Verse 35 says, oh, that I had one to hear me. God, where are you? Oh, that the judge was here to hear me. And now he says, and this is a parenthetical note that he puts here, here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. It's like that word that's translated signature in my Bible is actually more like the word mark or X. You think of, put your X on the dotted line. That they would make their mark to sign their name. And this is literally what it's saying. Here is my signature. I've given this, it's like a legal document. I've made this case that I am innocent. And here I'm signing it. And I'm giving it to the Almighty. And let him answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. He says, I don't even know what I've been accused of. I've suffered this what I feel like is a punishment. All of these things have happened to me. I feel like that's a punishment, but I don't even know what I'm guilty of. Oh, that my adversary would have written it down so I could see it. My indictment. And of course, there wasn't an indictment on Job. That's the part, he was right about that. There wasn't an indictment. This wasn't a punishment to Job. The suffering that he endured was not a punishment to him. But to Job, it seemed like a punishment. And so he's kind of demanding, this is where he's demanding vindication. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would carry my indictment on my shoulder. I would bind it on me as a crown if I had this indictment. I would give him an account of all my steps. I would answer for whatever it is that I'm indicted for. Like a prince, I would approach him. And so he's demanding this vindication from God. And then he concludes with these three verses. And it's kind of interesting, the rest of this has been about relationships with God, relationships with people. But now he turns and he says, if my land has cried out against me. and its furrows have wept together. This is in one sense, it's a personification, but in another sense, we see different passages of Scripture that talk about the land. We hear, if you're silent, the trees will clap their hands. The rocks will cry out and will give glory to the Almighty. And in Romans chapter 8, where we see Paul talking about suffering, we see that all creation has groaned since the time when sin entered the world, the curse entered the world, and even all of creation. And so, we see that it's not merely a personification. There's something real to it. If my land has cried out against me, and its furrows have wept together, if I have eaten its yield without payment, you take care of your land. You till it, you weed it, we give it fertilizer. I don't know what they did back in that time to give it fertilizer. Maybe it had enough nutrition that it didn't need that. I don't know what they did, but maybe they left the whatever grass and whatever to rot and to then be cultivated back into the soil. I don't know, but if I have eaten its yield without payment and made its owners breathe their last, let thorns grow instead of wheat, and foul weeds instead of barley. And the words of Job are ended. And so we see here, even though Job understood in chapter 28, he understood where wisdom was, that wisdom was found in fearing God and turning from evil. And even though that's the way he had lived, we're told that in both chapter 1 and chapter 2, we see in these 3 chapters an appeal based on he knows that he has done right. He has lived that way. He has feared God, and he doesn't understand. He can't correlate the life that, the things that he's seeing happen to him with what he knows of God. The hedge of protection has been removed. Satan has been allowed to bring this chaos, and that is what he's living in. I apologize that we've already gone over. Hopefully it won't be too much longer here. I just want to close with really 2 different ideas. In a time of suffering, there are things that are appropriate and even necessary. Grieving loss is both appropriate and necessary. It is good for us to recognize our loss, the things that we had that we no longer have. One of those things gives us the ability to say, with Job, the Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. That was God's blessing. Yes, he's withheld that blessing, but he did give me that blessing. There's a phrase that I think the world means in a different way, so bear with me as I say it, but I want you to hear it in the way that I think it's appropriate to hear. It's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. I mean, we think of that as having a relationship and then having a breakup, but no, that's not what it means to me. Dawn loved her husband, Kenneth. I loved Nancy, and I lost her. And that's better to have shared that life with her and to have lost her than never to have shared that with her at all. Grieving loss is appropriate and necessary. In it we see God's blessings that he's given to us in the past. Recognizing our condition, our situation that we're in, is appropriate and necessary. And Job does that through chapter 30. He recognizes the current misery that he's in. There's nothing wrong with that. You go through the book of Psalms and you see David cry out to God throughout the book of Psalms. Now, I heard someone say one time that if you were to go through the book of Psalms and look for the Psalms of lament and misery and count them, and then count the Psalms of praise and joy, that the Psalms of praise and joy are more than the songs of lament. But we typically remember the ones that are of lament because we identify with those. When we go through struggle, we identify with those, recognizing our condition, the difficulty that we're in is appropriate and necessary. This is not bad. We don't want to live in denial. No, we need to live in reality. Evaluating ourselves in the light of God's word, which he does in chapter 31. He evaluates his choices, and he lays them all out. I think that's a good thing. It's appropriate and necessary. We need to evaluate. That's one of the blessings of grief, is that it gives us an opportunity to evaluate, reevaluate our choices in our lives. And I would say that most often we won't be measuring up the way Job was measuring up. We will be finding things that we need to change, and that's a blessing to us, because then we can live more rightly. We can fear God and turn away from evil. Maintaining our integrity in the loss, in this time of suffering, maintaining our integrity is appropriate and necessary. We need to continue to live according to his ways. And then we must walk the fine line between legitimate grief and self-righteous vindication. You know, I just don't think that any one of us would be able to do as Job did and say, you know, here's my life, you know, come and judge me, God, you know. He laid his life out there and he asked for God's judgment. That would be a very fearful thing for me to do. No, I can't walk in that self-righteous vindication. And the last thing is something that is inappropriate, which I think we can all recognize. Demanding an answer from God is not appropriate. It's not something we should be doing. Job got an answer, but it wasn't the answer he was looking for. He wanted to know why. And in a few weeks, we'll get to God's response, and God does not tell him why. Well, I hope that this wasn't too heavy of a message this morning, but as we endure difficulty and suffering, may we remember that continuing to fear him and to walk according to his the principles, the order of things that he set out, that's where we find wisdom, and we, you know, wisdom is not the answer why. That's not an answer to the question why. Wisdom is how to live